Welcome to the sixth podcast. In this podcast, we will explain how we obtain the market demand and the market supply from the individual demands and supplies. Then, what is a market equilibrium? We will also wonder, is the market equilibrium efficient? What is efficiency in the sense of Pareto? And we will finish by stating the two fundamental theorems of welfare economics. First, we want to aggregate the individual demands to find the market demand. Remember that these individual demands are obtained from utility maximization. Let's assume that we have two consumers. Here are their demand curves, which are their marginal willingness to pay for the good. For the given price P0, consumer 1 demands the quantity A of the good, and consumer 2 demands the quantity B of the good. So, together with price P0, the two consumers demand A plus B of the good. We can add up these demand curves for all prices to finally obtain the market demand curve. Note that the aggregation is done horizontally, since we have to add up quantities to determine the final demand of all consumers. Second, we want to aggregate the individual supplies to find the market supply. This is done in a similar manner. Remember that the individual supply is obtained from profit maximization. Let's assume that we have two producers. Here are their supply curves, which are their marginal willingness to pay for producing the good. For a given price, P1, for example, producer 1 supplies the quantity C of the goods, and producer 2 supplies the quantity D of the good. So together, producers 1 and 2 supply C plus D units of the good to the market. Again, we can do this for any other prices and aggregate horizontally the individual supplies in order to get the market supply curve. So here are the market supply curve that we denote by S of P and the market demand curve that we denote by D of P. Where the two curves intersect is called the market equilibrium. Here it intersects at price P star and for quantity Q star. A natural question which arises is, why is P star Q star an equilibrium? Assume that the price is for some reasons below the price P star. As you can see on the graph, at this price, the quantity supplied is smaller than the quantity demanded. So there is an excess demand at this price, which means that not all consumers who want to purchase this good at this price can actually make their purchase because there is not enough supply. For the quantity supplied at price P, consumers are willing to pay the price P1 for the next unit. Remember that the demand is falling, so at price P, they have a higher marginal willingness to pay for this good than at price P star. This means that there is some upward pressure on the price. But then, at price P1, you can see that there is an excess of supply this time, more supply than demand. Which means that not all firms who want to sell the good at this price can actually sell it, because there's not enough demand. So if they want to sell this quantity, they will need to meet the market demand, which makes the price fall at price P2. So this step created a downward pressure on the price. Again, at price P2, market demand is greater than market supply, so there is an excess demand, although the gap between supply and demand is smaller than before. This goes until the market equilibrium is reached. In other words, when there is neither excess of demand nor excess of supplies. So only if P is equal to P star, then no market agent, consumer or producer, has an incentive to change her behavior, because all consumers that are willing to consume the goods at this price are able to purchase the goods. And all producers that are willing to supply the goods are able to sell their goods as well. So how can we evaluate the market equilibrium? Does the market equilibrium have any good or bad properties? For this, we need two definitions. The first definition is that an allocation is an assignment of resources to agents, consumers or producers, say an allocation of goods, for example. The second definition is that such an assignment of resources is said Pareto efficient or Pareto optimal if it is impossible to make any one individual better off without making at least one individual worse off. If it is possible to make an individual better off without making any other individual worse off, then we say that this is a Pareto improvement. This concept stems from the Italian economist and engineer Wilfred Pareto, who made several contributions in the field of economics. So one important property of the market equilibrium lies in the first theorem of welfare economics. Any competitive equilibrium is Pareto efficient. That means that at the market equilibrium in a competitive market, we can't make any individual better off without making any other individual worse off. So this is the best outcome we can achieve in terms of Pareto efficiency. This theorem relies on three intuitions that I'm going to give you. First, in equilibrium, S of P star is produced. The question is it possible to allocate this amount in a way that makes some consumers better off without making the others worse off? In other words, can we achieve a Pareto improvement? And if so, that would make the market equilibrium Pareto inefficient. So, all consumers that buy this good have a marginal willingness to pay that is greater or equal to P star. Remember that the marginal willingness to pay curve, which is also the demand curve, is falling. All consumers that buy the good on this market must have a marginal willingness to pay greater than P star. All other individuals have a marginal willingness to pay which is smaller than P star for the good, so they don't buy it. Now, if we transfer the good from someone that has a marginal willingness to pay greater than P star to someone whose marginal willingness to pay is smaller than P star, then it is clear that the first consumer loses more than the second consumer gains. This is because the first consumer is willing to pay more for the good than the second consumer is. Hence, there's no compensation that the second consumer could pay to the first one, such that the first consumer is not worse than before. So we cannot make anyone better off than before with such a transfer without making another one worse off. No Pareto improvement is possible. Second, in equilibrium again, S of P star is produced. Is there any possibility to allocate this amount in a way that makes some producers better off without making the others worse off? Assume that one firm produces 1 unit less, but another one that has not produced before produces 1 unit more. Of course, firm 1 saves marginal cost MC that are smaller or equal to P star. Because remember that the marginal cost curve is increasing and all firms that have a marginal cost below or equal to this market price will produce. So if firm 1 that has produced before now does not produce this 1 unit, she saves the marginal cost, which are smaller or equal to P star. But at the same time, firm 1 foregoes a revenue of P star because she doesn't produce. And firm 2 incurs a marginal cost that is higher than P star and only gets an additional revenue of P star, so she makes a loss on this unit. Therefore, firm 2 could not pay anything to firm 1, such that firm 1 is better off than before. So again, no Pareto improvement is possible in this case. We cannot make a firm better off without making another firm worse off. Third, is there any amount other than S of P star such that we can achieve a Pareto improvement? So such that we can make someone better off without making anyone worse off? Assume that one additional unit is produced on the market. The cost of producing this additional unit is the marginal cost by definition, which is higher than P star. But there is no consumer that is willing to pay more than P star for this unit because the demand curve is falling. So the consumer could not compensate the producer for producing this additional unit such that the consumer would be better off by consuming this additional unit and the firm would not be worse off. And there is an analogous argument for producing one unit less. So again, no Pareto improvement is possible, and we have shown with these three intuitions that the market equilibrium on a competitive market is efficient, because no Pareto improvement is possible. An interesting property of the competitive equilibrium is that it maximizes the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Let's remember what we learned before. On this diagram, the consumer surplus is above the market price and below the demand curve, while the producer surplus is above the supply curve and below the market price. Now, to see that the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is maximized in a competitive equilibrium, assume that we are at a higher price than the market price P star, say at P star star. That could be the case in a monopolistic market. Just to ease answers here, let's give letter names to each area on this diagram. So what's the consumer surplus here in terms of area? What is the producer surplus? What is then the total welfare? And finally, what is the loss in welfare compared to the market equilibrium P star, Q star? I would suggest you pause for a while this podcast to think about the answers. The consumer surplus is actually A here, because this is the area between the market price and the demand curve. The producer surplus is B plus E, because this is the area between the supply curve and the market price. Of course, given the quantity Q star star supplied to the market at price P star star. So the total welfare is just the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, so A plus B plus E. But before, at the market price P star, the consumer surplus was A plus B plus C, and the producer surplus was E plus F. So what do we actually lose in welfare compared to before? Well, we lose C plus F. And we often refer to this as the deadweight loss. There is a second theorem in welfare economics. Remember that the first theorem states that competitive markets allocate resources efficiently. Therefore, there is no reason to intervene in such a market, since there is efficiency. We cannot make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. So we can let the markets do their work. However, there are often many Pareto efficient allocations that is many market equilibria that have the property of Pareto efficiency. For example, a different market equilibrium could be achieved if the individuals had different incomes, so different demands. If we want to achieve a particular Pareto efficient allocation, we can distribute incomes and then let the market take over. This leads us to the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics. Any desired Pareto efficient allocation can be supported as a competitive equilibrium if incomes or wealth are transferred appropriately. So we can always find a redistribution of income or wealth so that we can support any desired Pareto efficient allocation as a competitive equilibrium. As a summary, we saw in this podcast how to aggregate individual demands and supplies into market demand and supply respectively. We also defined what the market equilibrium is, and we have seen that Pareto efficiency applies if the sum of the producer surplus and the consumer surplus is maximized. We also explained the two fundamental theorems of welfare economics.